In this lesson, we will dive into and explore several different kinds of leases you might encounter when you are working as a real estate professional. Certain types of leases tend to be more common in residential leases as opposed to commercial leases, and vice versa. We will look at key components and differences using examples to help you understand them. The first type of lease we will look at is called a gross lease. A gross lease is a lease where the landlord, also called the lessor, is responsible for paying all of the costs that come up related to operating and maintaining the property. Under a gross lease, the landlord also pays all of the real estate taxes. While a standard gross lease says the landlord pays for everything, a gross lease could also be modified to say that the tenant would pay utility bills. Most often, residential leases are gross leases, and some commercial leases are gross leases. Now, let's look at an example of a gross lease in action. Terry is an insurance agent and wants to rent out some office space in his neighborhood to set up his insurance agency. He works with a commercial real estate agent to find and tour several possible spaces that might meet his needs. His agent tells him that all of the office space in the area he is looking at renting is offered on a gross lease basis. When Terry finds the perfect space at the perfect monthly price, he is ready to sign the lease. Sure enough, the lease says that the landlord will pay for property taxes, property insurance, and ongoing maintenance and upkeep. The landlord will pay for the costs of heating and cooling the building, as well as the water bills, cleaning the building's common areas and parking lot, and paying for keeping the building's facilities in good working order. Terry's insurance agency will be responsible for paying its own internet and telephone expenses and for purchasing business insurance to cover the business property inside the leased space. Terry's lease is an example of a gross lease. The next type of lease we are going to look at, net lease, is essentially the opposite of a gross lease. Under a net lease, the tenant, also called the lessee, is responsible for paying their agreed-upon rent plus additional expenses like taxes, insurance, and maintenance costs. Net leases are very common for some office tenants and other companies leasing commercial space to run their businesses. Underneath the net lease umbrella, there are actually 3 different types of net leases. Let's explore them now. A single net lease is an agreement where the tenant pays the rent plus the property taxes. The landlord is still responsible for paying the costs of insurance and maintenance for the space rented to the tenant. Using our example from earlier, Terry's lease would have been a single net lease if his rent included a fixed monthly rental amount plus a prorated amount for property taxes based on the square footage of the office space Terry rented. If a tenant signs a double net lease, they are agreeing to pay the rent, the property taxes, and insurance premiums for insuring the building or space rented. For a tenant in a multi-unit building or mall, these costs are usually prorated based on the percentage of the building a tenant is occupying or leasing. Under a double net lease, the landlord still pays the costs associated with maintaining the property. A tenant might find what they thought was a really cheap rent amount is actually not such a good deal when they learn that they are responsible for also paying the property insurance and property taxes. As any homeowner knows, These costs can add up quickly, and they can change from year to year based on any number of factors outside the tenant's control. Finally, a triple net lease is a lease contract where the tenant is agreeing to pay the rent, plus the property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, including repairs. In recognition of the fact that the tenant is responsible for paying those expenses, the monthly rent is typically lower than what a tenant would pay for a single net lease or a double net lease. John and Jane want to open a corner convenience store in their neighborhood. Working with their real estate agent, they found a perfect spot. Their realtor quotes them a very attractive rental price, which will help them get their store going faster. However, when they review the lease, they learn that they are also going to be responsible for arranging for and paying for any maintenance or upkeep to the building while they are leasing it. They also need to pay the property taxes to the county twice a year, and they will be responsible for obtaining and maintaining a sufficient amount of commercial property coverage for the building. If they sign the lease, John and Jane will be entering into a triple net lease. Next, let's explore a type of lease called a percentage lease. A percentage lease is a lease on the property where the amount of rent is based on how much business the tenant brings in at that location on a monthly or annual basis. This is typically expressed as a percentage of gross receipts, although smart landlords will include a minimum base rent amount. Percentage leases are commonly used by retail stores that lease space in shopping malls, strip malls, or other multi-tenant spaces. The owner can negotiate a percentage of the store's sales by attracting and leasing other tenants for nearby storefronts, with the idea being that customers of one store will be likely to visit another store or business while they're there shopping anyway. Let's look at a percentage lease in action, as that might help illustrate this concept a little better. Franny wants to open a smoothie shop and is looking at leasing some prime space in a strip mall near a busy intersection in her town. She thinks the location is perfect, as it is in the same strip mall as a fitness center, a bookstore, and a coffee shop. When she reviews the terms of the lease, she notices that the lease provided for the following payments. Minimum/base rental amount, $4,000 per month, or $48,000 per year. Natural breakpoint amount of 7%, $57,142.86. This means that when Franny's sales go over $57,142.86, she will have to pay her landlord an additional 7% of her business sales, in addition to the $4,000 per month she is already paying. This is what is known as a percentage lease. Franny may be able to negotiate a higher breakpoint amount in an attempt to fix her monthly expenses. Another type of commercial lease is what is called a graduated lease. Sometimes graduated leases are also called graded, index, or step-up leases. With a graduated lease, rent payments are not fixed. Instead, they can vary periodically. Graduated leases are common for long-term lease arrangements, protecting a landlord lessor by adjusting the amount of rent due every 1, 5, or even 10 years. For shorter-term leases, graduated leases can help entice business owners to lease space by requiring a smaller outlay of funds in the early years while the business establishes itself and gets up and running. There are different types of graduated leases. In some, the rent payment due graduates upward each month, every quarter, every year, or on some other predefined basis. In other graduated leases, the monthly rent may go up or down based on the Consumer Price Index, based on periodic appraisals of the property rented, or by some other factor the landlord and tenant agree to ahead of time. An example might help you understand graduated leases in action. Let's say your city ended up closing one of its elementary schools last year due to low enrollment. As luck would have it, a local arts cooperative has outgrown its current space and is interested in leasing the now vacant elementary school building to use for art classes and performances. Having just received a major grant from a donor and being confident that they can continue to grow the arts community in the city, the cooperative decides to enter into a 20-year lease with the city for the space. Their lease provides that every 5 years, the rent will be increased by any corresponding increase in the Consumer Price Index. This is what is known as a graduated lease. Next, let's look at ground leases. A ground lease is an agreement to use land, not a structure or unit of a building, although sometimes that lease is secured by improvements the tenant makes to the land. Typically, ground leases cover a long time period, often between 50 and 99 years. With the ground lease, ownership of the land itself is separated from ownership of the buildings or improvements the tenants build on that land. Ground leases are commonly used by well-known corporate tenants. Many fast food and retail store corporations will enter into ground leases instead of trying to purchase the land where they build their stores and restaurants. The tenant doesn't have to come up with funds to buy the land. They just need to come up with funds to lease it, significantly lowering the initial out-of-pocket expense so they can put that money towards constructing and running their new stores. Landowners may like ground leases because they can provide a predictable, steady income stream. These types of leases often include features similar to those we discussed earlier when we explored graduated leases, so the tenant in a ground lease can expect their rent to rise over time. Now, let's look at an example of a ground lease. Mega Department Stores is expanding into your city and wants to find a spot to open their newest mega store. They explored available existing retail space but did not find anything that would suit their needs. So, they began looking for land where they could build a new store. When they found a suitable plot of land on the edge of town, they negotiated with the landowner and ultimately ended up signing a lease rather than buying the property from her. The lease gives them the right to use the land they are leasing for the next 99 years and to build on and improve the land with their new retail establishment. Mega Department Stores, as the lessee, is entirely responsible for the cost of construction, maintenance, upkeep, hazard insurance, and property taxes. In exchange, they pay a fixed rental amount to the lessor landowner. The lease provides that, every 5 years, the amount of rent will be adjusted for inflation. This provides protection to the landowner. Mega Department Stores has signed a ground lease to lease what will be the site of their newest store. Finally, let's look at another type of lease, an oil and gas lease. Under an oil and gas lease, the lessor, landowner, and the lessee, the oil and gas company, agree that the lessee will have access to the oil and gas on the lessor's property. These types of leases are usually for a set time period. Leases should clearly spell out the description of the property, what the lease allows the lessee to do, how much the lessee will pay the lessor, and how long the lease will remain in force. When it comes to payments and compensation, oil and gas leases typically provide for three types of payment. First, the lessee might pay the landowner a bonus payment up front. Second, oil and gas leases generally provide for an annual fixed rent payment. Finally, oil and gas leases often include royalty clauses, which say that the landowner will get a percentage of the profits from the lessees drilling on their land. Usually, if drilling is underway when the lease period is set to expire and oil or gas is being produced, the lease will remain in effect. Here's an example of an oil and gas lease. Patty owns land in North Dakota that has been in her family for generations. When she is approached by Oil and Gas R Us, Inc., she isn't sure what kind of lease she should enter into with them to allow them to drill on her land. After researching her options and talking to her real estate and legal professionals, she decides to enter into an oil and gas lease with the company. The lease has a primary duration of 5 years, specifying that Oil and Gas R Us, Inc. must drill a well within that primary lease period. If they do follow through by drilling the well, then the lease will continue for a secondary period of 10 years, or as long as the well continues to produce oil or gas, whichever is longer. In exchange for letting Oil and Gas R Us, Inc. drill and use a well on her property, Patty will receive an initial bonus payment upfront and an annual fixed payment during the lease term. She will also receive periodic royalty checks from what the well is actually producing from her land. She might also be able to negotiate for free gas for household use during the term of the lease. In conclusion, there are several different types of leases, but don't let these differences overwhelm you. Remember that a lease where the landlord pays all expenses is considered a gross lease, and a lease where the tenant is responsible for some or all of the property taxes, insurance, or maintenance is considered a net lease. Beyond that, the various types of leases will depend largely on the type of business leasing the property or land and what their intended use is.